Welcome to the first of two of our final HMEI faculty seminar series seminars in Geo Hall, right? We will take a brief pause after these two, and then we will reconvene in the fall of 2025 in the new environmental studies building that all of us have been seeing sort of creep up out of the ground. So if you're going to close something out, a chapter, I think it's important to close it out well. And here we are pleased to have Professor Bethany Wiggin joining us. Bethany is it works in the field of environmental humanities, and we've been fortunate to have her on campus for the past semester and a bit. Last semester, Bethany gave a class, let me find it, on climate storytelling, and this semester is giving a course on outliving fossil fuels. Bethany, when she's not gracing us with her presence here at Princeton, is at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and in the Department of German linguistics. French, Italian, and Germanic studies. Sort of draw that on the map, it all fits together. The former Charlemagne, I don't know. Okay, so Bethany was also the founding director of the Penn program in environmental humanities. And this is really all exciting for us because the reason Bethany's here with us is that she's this year's Barron visiting professor in the environmental humanities. And so this is a thrill. We're going to hear today at a time when there's a lot going on in the world. And so I think this will be a very relevant talk for the moment, but I think also will resonate for the future. So Bethany, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabe, and thanks to all of you who are here. It's such a busy time. I'm really grateful to be here. Again, thanks for the introduction. And thanks especially, I want to just take a second to thank all at HMEI who have really welcomed me here. It's been a really marvelous place to be and a nice respite of sorts from my day job. I especially want to thank some students, current and former, who are here today. I know how busy you all are, and I'm amazed always at how much you do, and that you found time to be here really means a lot. And I also want to thank those who may be watching online live or in the future. I got a lot of really gracious notes from colleagues locally and further afield saying that they were in very important hiring meetings and faculty senate meetings, et cetera. But I really am looking forward to conversations both in this room and then enduring. So let's begin. And I thought, given today's news, that we might actually begin in the future. So let's take a trip to the future, to the year 2074, when first-year Princetonian Angela Osegbofo will be 70 years old. Angela receives a letter from her grandchild who wants to thank her. I breathed for the first time today. For the first time, I took off my mask and breathed, and the air is sweet. It's a strange feeling. It's beautiful. I'm standing on the ruins of I-95, right along the new coast of old America, and if you could see how the earth has taken it back, you would be stunned. The concrete stretches have given way for all kinds of twisted weeds, and the mile markers have been harvested for animal feeders and new high-speed rail tracks. Curious children are discovering the last remains of a faded wah-wah billboard, half sunken underground. You told me stories of life in the 10s and the 20s, of the capital-dependent, car-indebted world that you tried so hard to end. I couldn't imagine a time when April showers didn't consume entire cities. I never heard the calm of trees swaying along in a forest trail, and so I didn't understand why you thought today that changed. In the same year of 2074, current sophomore, here in the front row, Michael Igbinoba, has become the NOAA administrator. Now, isn't that a future you want to think about? Like Angela, Michael wrote his letter from the future in response to an assignment in last semester's workshop-based class, Climate Storytelling for Climate Action. It was offered in conjunction with a climate literacy project, My Climate Story, that I'm going to return to a little bit later. Earlier in the semester, Michael had read and reviewed a book by a climate denier, one of the many real-life people today who believe that while climate change is real, it can be dealt with later with modest, incremental, and easily implementable tech solutions. These are the same people who today mandate federal agencies to talk about climate resilience rather than climate change. Michael's letter is addressed to this climate-denying author. He says, I sit in my underground office, brightly lit and powered by geothermal energy. These shelters, built deep beneath the surface, are necessary as the world above has become too harsh in many regions due to climate change. The hum of air filters and energy systems surrounds me as I recall the books you wrote during my undergraduate years. Today, I serve as the Undersecretary for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA Administrator. NOAA, once criticized and undermined in your era, now leads the global effort to address humanity's impact on the environment. Our ability to predict and navigate climate challenges has become essential for survival. And he continues a little bit to say, the difference between your time and mine is stark. In the 2020s, scientific warnings grew louder, but fossil fuel interests and climate skeptics, including yourself, sowed doubt and delayed action. However, grassroots movements led by youth demanded change. Advances in renewable energy offered a path forward, and over time, humanity's desire for a cleaner, safer future overcame resistance. The doubts you championed became a footnote in history, overshadowed by humanity's determination to create a livable future. In the end, the desire to protect our world for future generations proved stronger than denial. Sincerely, Michael. So sign me up for that future, please. Back in December 2024, at the end of the semester, I asked these students to reflect on your personal climate stories and on the fictional and non-fictional climate stories we read, wrote, and interviewed to get this semester. What stands out? Writing anonymously, their takeaways were all variations of these three comments you see. They were impressed, negatively, quote, by the false narratives of sustainability and living the same consumption-oriented lifestyles, but greener. They wanted to understand more about, quote, what inspires and encourages people to actually create change, because knowledge, and I think they mean by that broadly speaking, what knowledge about what causes climate change isn't actually the problem, since it's well known. They insisted instead that, quote, justice should inherently be at the center of climate environmental discussions. Imagination is crucial for climate action, and hope and hopelessness sometimes doesn't matter as much as feeling empowered. Of the various topics that we discovered and explored in our seminar, they gave the most weight to, as you see in the top bar here, theories and practices of transformational environmental education. And by that, we understand as theories and practices about how environmental education can transform learners who in turn transform environments from the local to the global. These are key to civic science. And today I'm going to focus my remarks on transformational learning experiences I've organized over the last decade as I've worked to establish a program in environmental humanities at a school not too far down the road, and one that bears some resemblance to Princeton, especially if you squint hard enough to look away from the hospitals and the business school that is the alma mater of President Donald Trump. These experiences, or these experiments, were conducted under the rubric of the environmental humanities. And in these remarks, I'll talk a little bit about that still awkward, if relatively familiar term, because I think it's helpful in thinking toward practices of civic science. I'm defining civic science as knowledge creation about enmeshed socio-materialities, We're complex assemblages, sometimes called nature cultures, whose practitioners come from sectors outside the normal science community, where peers extend to sectors outside the academic community, stakeholders and interested parties, those that are affected by a policy, and ultimately civil society are potential contributors as well as assessors of actionable knowledge claims. So the talk is in 3 parts. Sorry, got the right page. In part 1, I'm going to lay some brief groundwork for considering civic science and situate it in proximity to other transdisciplinary formations, including the environmental humanities and sustainability sciences. In the second part, I'm surveying a community of practice that has come into being in Philadelphia through place-based teaching and learning, which I think is an important crucible for the creation of civic science. And the third part dives into a climate literacy and engagement project designed to amplify the voices of future life worlds and future generations now, a storytelling and story sharing project called My Climate Story. So let's dive in. Across the arts and sciences, broad consensus exists that we have to stop educating our students as if we inhabit a world that no longer exists. In that modern, bygone world, nature, or the environment, or more than human worlds, existed apart from humans, in a separate realm available for objective scrutiny, as well as for material exploitation and resource extraction. Working today amidst proliferating anthropogenic landscapes, such a separation seems fanciful at best. Rather, floating in a sacrifice zone that I've written about as the cradle of petromodernity, it seems all too apparent that we have never been modern, and the nature of the future has long been here. It's worth noting how students' visions of the futures, Angela's story of children playing amidst ruination, or Michael's scientist policymaker working full out to anticipate superstorms, how these future images actually resemble worlds today, where centuries of colonialist and racialized capitalist logics have altered local and global ecologies beyond recognition. For several decades, geologists and many others have debated whether humans have forced a new age in geologic time, surpassing safe operating spaces and transgressing planetary boundaries. These debates have launched a raft of neologisms, and I don't want to really belabor those here. And I think more than anything, they've revealed the unnaturalness, the contingency, and the historicity of modern capitalist colonialist land tenure systems. And they've helped to recall other, both older and newer, land relations, including mutually beneficial relations supported by practices of traditional ecological knowledges and indigenous sciences, of coordinated epistemologies, to use the word by Kyle White, and of commoning and others. Simultaneously, universities are being called upon to take bolder action in light of the urgency and magnitude of these ecological challenges produced by centuries of exploitation. Students and scholars urge universities to move, in Sharon Stein's word, beyond sustainability, and to work instead to repair the injustices of entwined social natural histories and to imagine what Moore and Milkerite call a rich and detailed set of possible futures and the various options and pathways that will lead to them. Such transformative work will transform the university, and I think on balance that's a good thing, if difficult. It will help us to promote a community-engaged approach to research and learning that expands beyond the individual institution of higher education in collaborative relationships and partnerships with non-academic partners at multiple scales, particularly among interdisciplinary teams in the global north and global south, and growing intergenerational research such as early career and graduate training opportunities and cross-cutting curricula across disciplines, across programs, departments, and schools. Writing in 2013-2014 from Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, During a theme year exploring the environmental turn and the human sciences, environmental historian Sverker Sorlin noted, quote, "The idea of environmentally relevant knowledge must change. We cannot dream of sustainability unless we start to pay more attention to the human agents of the planetary pressure that environmental experts are masters at measuring but seem unable to prevent." While conferences, journals, and even courses of study in environmental humanities have since popped up, especially across Europe and North America, the term environmental humanities in practice has also provoked serious frustration, including mine. For some, the term has enabled, quote, more inclusive and creative change-making, and the, quote, recognition that articles and books that reach only specialized audiences within one's own discipline are not the only potential outputs of academic research. For others, the term has been an update that produces more of the same, eco-criticism by another name. Still others, including Caroline Levine, warn of creeping quietism and urge that practical environmental activism should be integral to humanist work. The term environmental humanities was coined to disrupt or estrange the expectation that environmental knowledge was the sole domain of the sciences. However, it has also sometimes estranged would-be allies in the sciences. Civic science, on the other hand, might help build coalitions. Together, humanists and scientists, academics and community members can draw knowledges and practices of making and unmaking environments back into a space of civic contemplation. Civic science exceeds instrumental notions of science communications. Its grounding in participatory research transforms the work itself, diversifying expertise beyond the conventional scientific community. As Sarah Wiley writes in her marvelous 2018 book, Fractivism, civic science, quote, enables communities to question the state of things and investigate issues of collective urgency to shape them to preserve the commons. We in universities need to engage and support the messy, complex work of civic discourse and negotiation. But how do we forge trusted partnerships and effective communities of practice? So to answer, let me do some showing and not just telling. So let's proceed from a place. By training, I'm a cultural historian of early modern Europe and North America, and of the networks that created colonial Atlantic worlds, including the region that became known as Pennsylvania. This is a 1755 map of parts of West New Jersey that is to become Pennsylvania. And here you see an inset of Philadelphia's city grids. And what I want to direct your attention to here is the way these map makers have tried to represent the confluence of the Delaware River with here the Schuylkill River. You see this cross hatching. It gives you a sense of the massive, massive marsh that existed well into the 19th century, of which today 200 acres are left in the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge. The Schuylkill River is one of present-day Philadelphia's two rivers, and it was named Schuylkill or Hidden River in Dutch because these colonial explorers knew it to be an important waterway for native informants, but they couldn't actually find the mouth of it amidst the vast marsh that straddled the confluence. This hidden river plays a vital role in a book I will finish this fall while on leave from Penn, entitled Utopia Found and Lost in Penn's Woods. And at my home institution, I work on the banks of the Schuylkill River, and I often spend time there when I need to take a break from reading to walk and to think. It's fair to say that this river has seeped into my work. It's called me to account, asking me to consider how such a bountiful place could be undone. 10 years ago, my response to the river began by reaching out to others who knew the waterway in a variety of ways, as hydrologists, kayakers, art historians, historians of science, engineers, wildlife refuge managers, artists, park managers, chemists, experiential and environmental educators, and others. They, I figured, could help me account for how it got made into the post-industrial river so prone to flooding and storm surge. Together, likely while paddling, atmospheric chemist and environmental engineer Peter DiCarlo and I dreamt up the idea for a Schuylkill River Research Corps, and we held visioning meetings off campus, and I think that was important, off campus, at Bartram's Garden along the river. The meeting generated working groups, and together we created proposals for projects we wanted to pursue. We set up longer-term goals of creating tours and shorter-term goals of setting up real-time public air quality monitors and of establishing an open access digital repository for materials about the river. I think of it and have written about it as a living archive of the river. It's online and maintained by our library. You can visit it at Schuylkill Corps. And next, Pete and I started up the research seminar, Schuylkill River Corps Research Seminar, which was a bi-weekly series of workshops. And we recorded the presentations and fed them into the archive. We then created a field school for students at several universities in the city, as well as for community fellows for whom we were able to provide modest stipends. And these were staff from Bartram's Garden, from John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, from the Independent Seaport Museum, as well as social practice artists. And I'll just show you, here's some materials that we collected from the archive, or that are in the archive. And I'll just show you a very brief clip about that field school that we
I think a lot of the exercises that we did at the on-water intensive were really geared toward promoting this bidirectional flow between community members and research. So on the one hand, having community members use the research in various aspects of the Schuylkill River and their projects, whether that be creating educational materials or helping people understand their health as it relates to the river. And on the other hand, having community members become stakeholders in research on the Schuylkill River.
We really wanted to be on boats, in part because we wanted to be able to look at certain bioindicators in the water that we could only really measure from a boat. But there's something incredibly powerful about the boat as a metaphor. We're thinking about the kind of collaborative communities we need that will keep us afloat in a watery future. We're thinking about the ethics of collaboration. Who floats in? Who floats out? And so that's what we're really practicing. And we really believe that it's these collaborations that can lead to effective action on climate.
So these teaching interventions helped us to further grow the archive, and along the way we grew increasingly attuned to the need to make sure that archival materials we were collecting also flowed back into the communities who made them and contributed them. We created oral history projects. These too went into the archives, but we also wanted to make sure that the oral histories were accessible not just online, but as I said, in those communities who contributed them. We partnered with John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, whose visiting center you see here, to create an oral history jukebox where neighbors and visitors to the center could open up the oral history volumes and listen to neighbors talking to them about their various concerns and memories of the neighborhood. We also worked with artists to connect academics and community members to the river. The Artist Collective, the Environmental Performance Agency, and you see artist Ellie Irons here, visited one class I taught, and we were able to deepen our collaborations by hosting them for a mini residency, which culminated in the creation of a Schuylkill River parkour. I've collaborated with many artists, and I have to say making the parkour was definitely my favorite. The EPA joined us as part of a related and ongoing project, an Ecotopian Toolkit for the Anthropocene, which, like the Schuylkill River Research Corps, has fostered a growing community of practice in Philadelphia, connecting academics and students, gardens, and museums. Here you can see the first museum exhibit that we collaborated on together 2 years ago, and students checking it out. And then in 2024, we also partnered with another garden, the Morris Arboretum and Gardens, in order to expand the project and make tools outside. It was a real treat to collaborate with Blue Lab on that. And the Ecotopian Toolkit will actually be traveling abroad for the first time with installations in Copenhagen and Stockholm in the fall. It'd be great to do something here at Princeton too, of course. The importance of the Schuylkill River Research Corps as a community practice, however, was really thrown into sharp relief when the oil refinery that had so long dominated the river exploded in June 2019, throwing centuries of slow violence into sharp relief. Some 1 million people live in this refinery's blast zone. And if you think that's a lot, one right across the river has 3 million people that live in the blast zone. But this close call, as the city called it, created a sudden and unexpected opening for futures beyond refining along the river. Various members of the Schuylkill River Research Corps sprang into action in the days and weeks after the explosion. Dr. DiCarlo served on the Mayor's Refinery Task Force, where I also offered testimony. We all drew extensively on our archival materials to amplify community voices and their longstanding experiences of flooding and toxicity and their concern for safety. I also designed a course that partnered with community organizations in South Philadelphia, particularly Resident Action Committee 2, and you see the president of that, the tall man standing on the left of that photo, Mr. Charles Reeves. Together, we considered what we could make together, what his organization, Resident Action Committee 2, wanted, what these students wanted and also needed in order to make assignments. We worked together to document what it's been like to live in the shadow of the East Coast's, what was the East Coast's largest refinery over generations of family. We made memory maps, we fed oral histories. These in turn helped us create podcast episodes and also generated community-led tours. I'm gonna show you an excerpt from this tour. In it, you will see 8th graders who are being led on this tour by the neighborhood organization. More than anything, the community residents wanted the creation of educational materials in local schools so that school children would have a way to understand their own history. So we offered workshops in these 8th grade classrooms. There were 4 workshops in total that we offered in 4 different schools. And then these students were led on tours by the community members whose oral histories we had helped to record. We also invited public health investigators, city officials, and journalists to come on the tour. So you'll see just a clip. In it, you'll hear Mrs. Tammy Reeves talking about her experiences growing up next to the refinery. I think you will. Maybe you won't. Let's see if I can play it from here. Hans, I might need you. I don't know why this one won't play. Yeah. It should.
Continue to lie and say it's not harmful. Well, it is harmful, very harmful. If they're closed down, why are there still fumes coming out of, So what they said was, Oh, they're cleaning the pipes over there. It's not hazardous. They told us it wasn't hazardous. If it's not hazardous, why do you need to put on hazmat when it's not?
We also worked with social practice artist Amy Balkin to create a memorial to lives lost for refining, and this too was at the request of the community neighbors. In the words of Mr. Reeves, shared as part of his archived oral history, he says, what he wants for the future of this refinery is for it to be made a cemetery. That thing should be a cemetery for everybody who can't afford to bury their family. Arts-driven and community-responsive projects offer powerful methods to introduce and amplify community voices into policy arenas. Diverse arts methods and practices, from storytelling to filmmaking to sound walks and more, are currently being tested by the working group Intersecting Energy Cultures. These are research teams made up of academic and community partners working in 10 historically energy-intensive sites. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip over some of this work, but I would love for you to explore it later. We have also made...
The basic challenge.
I'm not going to show you the films, but for each of the teams, we've made documentary films, and they're part of a set of research outcomes that we're committed to. When working with community partners, we of course realized that making more academic articles was important, but not sufficient. And thus we taught ourselves to make collaborative documentary films. And here, as you can see, we also committed to writing policy briefs, digesting what we had learned together and sharing it with local and regional policymakers. For the first time this summer, I offered a policy brief writing sprint together with some energy policy colleagues. So part of the ways that we're expanding the kinds of practices that we do in civic science. So I want to turn just briefly to the final part of my talk and talk again about that project, My Climate Story, that also includes place-based learning, but it's a project that's designed explicitly to amplify future voices, youth, including the students, of course, whose stories we started with. So My Climate Story is a public research project to document and share personal and local experiences of global climate change. It includes a free curriculum, including a series of customizable participatory workshops. We've made a documentary film about it. We've created a lot of teacher and student resources, and we've generated a story bank where hundreds of storytellers have shared personal narratives of climate change tagged up with light metadata to make them searchable by location, climate impact, and including the author's feelings. I've been really delighted actually to go to conferences and have teachers come up to me and say, wait a minute, do you help make that story bank? Teachers are using it a lot in their classrooms to really try to give global climate change a more personal and textured face. So in these stories, contributors share that they are unsurprisingly worried, sad, and anxious, but they also tell us that sharing their stories helps them to feel less alone and empowered to take climate action. As we tell climate participants, climate stories can illuminate and explore the impact of changing climates on people's everyday lives. It's climate stories that make climate data meaningful and actionable. Now, this project was somewhat improbably born during pandemic, and despite the inauspicious circumstances, it's actually thrived. To this day, I have never met the undergraduate interns, I've never met in person, the undergraduate interns who were so vital to starting this project. You'll see them in this documentary, which I'm, again, not gonna show you just in the interest of time. They also helped to write the curriculum workbook as well as the script for that documentary. As we moved out of pandemic, we began to test our modest curriculum in Philadelphia high schools, and we've since supported the creation and running of 9 climate classrooms across the city who piloted these workshops, and they created additional curricular resources. We've partnered with WHYY, our local NPR affiliate, with a listening audience of about 975,000 people to expand students' storytelling chops. Students' stories have been broadcast by WHYY, and we co-hosted a festival with WHYY sharing Philadelphians' climate stories. I have to say that the network has been extremely generous. They've run workshops for students who receive modest stipends to participate in the project. In addition to being climate storytellers, they were taught also to be climate reporters. I think it was really this experience that drew us with some undergraduates to create a university kind of equivalent of what we called the Campus Correspondence Project. We ran the Campus Correspondence Project.
Change really happens.
Sorry, let's try that again. Really with the under the direction of 2 undergraduate students, Maria Villarreal Simon and Faith Bochert, and you'll hear Maria and Faith talking about this Campus Correspondence Project. The Campus Correspondents were a group of 12 undergraduate students who applied from programs across North America to be trained as campus correspondents and to report on their campus's climate stories. So here, Maria and Faith we're about halfway through the project at this time. This is about March of last year, and they're thinking about what the next steps will be. Sorry, we're having so many problems here. Sorry, it's another embedded clip. It worked earlier, but doesn't want to play again. Thank you.
Change really happens from education. So if we get a sense from these campus correspondents and from their stories that this is how students are feeling all over the country, that we're missing climate education, then hopefully we can get some climate curriculum implemented into some schools.
And if we can hear from students, just like you said, all around the country and all around the world that are feeling really distressed about the trajectory of our climate, that's something that I think we can put in front of a politician. That's something we can put in front of our representatives and in the media to call attention to this.
So based on this hopes that you hear Faith expressing there that we want to get these stories in front of wider audiences, I decided to create an op-ed essay writing sprint, again, a kind of rapid writing response that we taught in April of last year. And I'll just say that it was really thrilling that over 30% of the op-ed essays that students ended up writing were picked up by their campus and local newspapers, a pretty high hit rate. Just to say, watch this space. My climate story is ongoing. I'm really delighted that HMEI is partnering with me and together with Yale's program on climate change communications for a storytelling summit. Save the date, April 10th. So let's get to the very end of my talk. What does this all mean? In working on these projects, I've learned many things. Collaboration is messy, it takes a lot of time. It is almost always worthwhile. In my own case, moving out of my disciplinary comfort zone has often been uncomfortable, to be sure. I have also had to learn a lot of new skills. Most importantly, more often than not, I've learned that I need to work with others inside and outside the academy and listen and learn all that I don't know. Students report that they love these classes in civic science that have helped to build the communities of practice that you've seen glimpses of in these slides. Students in my new class, thank you for being here today, guys, called Outliving Fossil Fuels, keep telling me they love moving outside traditional classrooms and to learn to see the world as a space of co-learning and participatory research with classrooms in museums and on streets, rivers, parks, waste yards, and along pipelines. This kind of transformational teaching and learning takes time. It's not a silver bullet that will somehow end climate change or magically undo the harms we humans have done to living systems. And yet, it is these civic science collaborations to encourage wider participation in remaking the world that offer me the most hope. Together, we can endeavor to see the worlds we've made in all their beautiful brokenness and to imagine them anew. Thank you.
Stand, sit, whatever you want.
Sorry, we can sit.
Okay, so we have entered the Q&A part of the afternoon. It's so for those of you on Zoom, I will be monitoring the computer here for any questions, and in the meantime, I will ask anyone on Zoom or present if they have questions, and in particular, if there is a student or a postdoc that has a question at the moment, it would be great to have, I'm assuming it says grad in the, yes. Not that you're, yeah.
Thanks. So towards the end of your presentation, we saw a Venn diagram that relates science, civics, and democracy. How do you delineate civic science and democratic science? And what are actions that individuals and institutions can enact to bring about democratic science and civic science?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So what's the difference between democratic science and civic science? I think that civic science is a subset of democratic science, as I understand it. Civic science is a little different from what's often called citizen science. Citizen science I understand to be participatory science, but one in which the citizens do what the scientists tell them to do. And civic science, on the other hand, as I tried to outline in the talk, really involves participatory research in which various forms of expertise, not solely from the traditional science community, are engaged, where participants from different sectors are helping to formulate the questions that the transdisciplinary research community will pursue. So the difference between civic science and democratic science, I would say, is that civic science is not proper for all, or it doesn't pertain to all of democracy, like various projects or questions, but of particular communities. And some of them may be, of course, global, but not necessarily. Okay, and if there are other questions, and I see a hand up there. And what time is that? 1 o'clock to me.
Thank you so much. This was a really awesome talk. Has me thinking a lot about my own pedagogy in the years ahead. I'm curious, with your work with the community activists in particular, whether or not there was an emphasis or attention called to the need for climate action outside of a typical institutional democratic framework. Because there's been this developing push in the literature recently about what kind of political action is necessary to contest sort of the forces of inequality and industry that know full well what the climate science says and are intent on robbing the planet anyway. So it's just a question on like personal experience and how common that talking point is.
Yeah, thanks for that really important question. I think one of the ways that I see the sort of I would call it super institutional responses, being formulated most effectively are really by centering justice. And I do think one of the reasons why I think that's so effective is that thinking about climate justice actually links contemporary climate impacts with much longer histories. And also kind of reveals that techno solutions are really only partial solutions. They're not gonna address the underlying causes of climate change, which are embedded in much longer histories of colonial injustice. Does that get at your question? Yeah. Yeah, there have been, of course, other political philosophers or political economists who write books with titles like "How to Blow Up a Pipeline," but then actually don't blow up pipelines, but are trying to think very carefully about where are the linkages where fossil fuel economics are vulnerable. So sort of building on, I think, historian Timothy Mitchell's work, where he's thinking about, well, one of the reasons why coal, students in my class right now, we're talking about this a lot, why coal was so effective for democratic participation is because there were choke points where miners and workers in coal could shut it down, whereas in a distributed system like the fossil fuel system, it's much harder to find those pinch points beyond blowing up a pipeline.
Allison.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for sharing all of this extraordinary work. It's been such a North Star for me. So I was curious if you've thought at all about kind of what kind of civic science is possible when a collaboration or coalition forms around a really specific place, and while the kind of members of that or participants in that project may have really different expertise and background, they all share a deep knowledge of the place, like the Schuylkill River, for example, versus projects of yours where there's been this kind of multi-sided or really, right, you're addressing a kind of big problem or topic like intersecting energy, but from all of these different places, like literal places, and sort of what you see as possible when it's really deep local work versus kind of, transnational or virtual.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. One of the things that has always been at the background of my interest in developing place-based projects is to really think about how that might be scaled. And that's really tricky to do, of course, because if you are deeply rooted in a place, how do you talk to other places? So this project, Intersecting Energy Cultures, is a working group that I was convinced to co-organize by a former postdoc, Dr. Rebecca Macklin. And what we wanted to do was, and I think what we've done fairly successfully, is we put out an open call for other place-based research communities who are working in energy-intensive cultures. So the idea that we weren't alone in Philadelphia in doing this, but we wanted to find ways to connect with other communities in which academic researchers were working with, or at least wanted to work with, community partners. So we put out this call for applications to the working group. And I will tell you, we were overwhelmed with the response. Like, we had seed funding from the University of Pennsylvania to seed 10 groups, and we got 96 applications. Each of the applications had a research project that was co-created and signed off by an academic partner and a community partner. And part of the way that we chose the working groups was on the strength and the convincingness of the actual partnership. Like that the community partners also really wanted to work with the academic partners and not only vice versa. That's one way that we've tried to scale, not giving up the importance of place-based knowledge, but instead trying to create umbrellas and networks to connect up others who are doing that work.
I was reminded to check the Q&A because we do have a question online. Capi Monillos asks, how did you find artists that contribute to these efforts? Do they normally work at the intersection of science and art?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The answer is that we have found artists in different ways. So some artist collaborations have resulted from open calls, such as the Ecotopian Toolmakers that Blue Lab took part in this past year. Each year, we've offered that project, I believe, 4 times now, and we'll offer it for at least one more time, 5th time. There's a call for artists. We have modest funding that we supply to successful proposals. So would-be Ecotopian toolmakers are often artists, but not exclusively. Sometimes there are other types of folks who want to get involved with that as well. So that's one way. We have also kind of by hit or miss identified artists who we really wanted to work with. And when I say we, I mean also students and graduate students and faculty who I have collaborated with. It's been one partnership which I particularly have loved. I didn't talk about it all today, but is actually with a devised theater company called Pig Iron Theater Company, and we made an opera together actually about climate change, sort of about a period of living, a period of animate existence. But working with devised theater artists really made me also think about the kinds of almost improvisational collaborations that we need. Also, I think in civic science, we don't have an existing playbook to deal with these wicked problems that we have. But I think we can learn a lot from artists' methods of creating learning communities. So that's different ways, I guess, of working with artists.
Rachel, over there.
Bethany, thank you so much. It's extraordinary to hear you talk about all of these things that you've done. And when you talked about the 96 applications and during your remarks mentioned the amount of traffic that you were seeing to I think it was a Story Bank website, it made me think of the question it's a really tricky one, and it's how do we, those of us who are doing this kind of work, how do we measure the outcomes? And I'm from just one person to another, what are some of the things that you do to see if it's hitting and having an effect?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rachel. I think it's a really important question. Like, how do you think about outcomes of works that it's just not citations, right? It's not conventional metrics of impact. So I think about this tirelessly as I write reports for deans and funders. And one of the ways that I have thought about it, I mean, I think you heard me say how happy I was to partner with WHYY because, and I said the number, they had 975,000 listeners. Now, not all 975,000 listeners were listening to the stories, like the multiple stories that the Climate Storytelling Project did with them. But at least I can say, we did this many stories with these media outlets that have this kind of reach. So that's one metric that I often go to. Another metric that I have frequently talked about are actually policy outcomes. And sometimes those policy outcomes are quite small. They are, introducing things into the city's public records or providing testimony for different, city or mayoral commissions. But sometimes they're actually quite large. I was spearheaded a project that was running in full gear about 8 years ago exactly, which I didn't talk about, but was called Data Rescue, in which over 51 library and learning communities hosted archive-a-thons to download, preserve, and copy federal data, particularly environmental data, and create a repository, which we called the Data Refuge Project. Now, this project engaged something like 6,000 people who gave up days of their lives to do this kind of archiving, and it also resulted in changing federal law about the kinds of repositories that the federal government had to make for born digital information. So that's another kind of outcome. Usually we don't get laws changed, but I think that's a pretty good one.
So I had a question, and maybe sort of as I sort of bringing the natural science way of thinking into this, one of the elements in the Venn diagram, I think, was bringing greater democratic influence on science or control. I forget which one of those words were. And given some of the things that have been happening recently outside this room, you could imagine that somebody would read that and interpret some of the things that are happening right now as just that there is not necessarily sort of bringing people's subjective perceptions of what is valuable or interesting into the scientific method. And so how does one distinguish between the virtuous and the non-virtuous versions of democratic influence on science, right? So science has a certain rigor to it that and process, and so how would I, if I came from Mars and didn't know the various parties in history and whatever, recognize virtuous versus non-virtuous external influence on science?
Thanks, Gabe. That is, of course, the question. And if I could answer it perfectly for you, we would live in a very simple world where we could move forward. So I have only partial answers for you. But one, I think, has to do with actually partially science literacy. This is not something that I probably need to tell you, but in thinking about what is disinterested science is also helping for people to understand that for-profit science or corporate underwritten science is not disinterested science. So if we're going to fund science with interest, then we need to have more interests also at the table. And I think that's where civic science and trying to find ways to introduce other stakeholders who can also influence science, let's say agendas, I think is really important. So that's one kind of answer. Another answer in terms of thinking about what would be good civic science, I think has to do very much with its participatory dimensions. So if participation is only from, let's say, Republicans or corporate interests or science conventional climate deniers, that's a very partial sort of group of the larger community who are participating in it. I think that since the Citizens United decision in this country, democracy has been really quite hampered. And one of the things civic science, I think, can do is to find ways to enable less moneyed actors to come into places. This is where I think universities have a real, like a kind of lighthouse role that we can play, where we can find ways to re-encourage people to enter into civic dialogue, people who have felt very disenfranchised or disempowered. And I think part of for me, what I find so compelling about civic science is the ways that it can help people to understand that certain kinds of science that have become seen as political are actually not political, they're just reality. But until we talk and meet people where they are, in their backyards, in their worlds, I think that the kind of know-it-all, kind of holier-than-thou dynamics will just stay the same, and that's a real turnoff for a lot of people. So I think meeting people where they are, doing science together, whether we call it science or inquiry or research, I think can go a long way toward building communities of trust who together can name and explore the questions that are important to them in their own communities.
So with that, I have been told to wrap up. And if you know me, you know I listen. So, so with that, so please join me again in thanking Bethany for a great discussion. And then I am going to bring your attention on Tuesday, March the 4th, we will have the final speaker for the Geo Hall version of the HMEI faculty seminar series, and it will be our own Navroz Dubash, a professor in public affairs at the School of Public International Affairs and at the High Meadows Environmental Institute. So please join us to listen to Navroz. Thank you.